All right, everybody, get back in here and settle down, and let's answer some questions. Woo! Okay. We are going to start with a question from Charlie Coster. Did I say that right? Probably not. I'm bad at names. What are some common reasons? Oh, sorry, we were going to start with a different question. I'm sorry. For those not in the know, is NoRed Inc. fully on board with supporting Elm development? Who funds it, and what if they stop? And Richard?
Oh, cool. Yeah, so for those who don't know, we hired Evan like January 2016. Is that right? Sounds right-ish?
2-ish years ago.
Yeah, 2-ish years ago. And yeah, so Evan's job is to make Elm stuff, and he actually doesn't work on our product at all. Like 100% of his time is spent working on Elm, and it's all open source, and like he owns all the IP. So yeah, I would say we're fully on board. I don't know how we could be more on board than that. Having said that, I mean, like, just to be totally honest, like, we're a startup, and like, startups are not necessarily around forever. We happen to be a successful startup, but I don't want to be like, oh yeah, NoRed Inc. will be around forever and like funding Elm forever and like everything is perfect forever. So like certainly we are fully on board, and certainly that's been working out great for us and I think for Elm. But like I can't be like the parent who promises everything will be fine forever. So to the question of like what if we stop, or like what if we stop existing for some reason? Like not worried, just concerned. Yeah, I mean honestly, I think Evan can probably speak to his own passion for working on Elm.
Yeah, so one of the things I think about is being set up so that I can just work on Elm all the time. So I'll be good for like 5 or 10 years. I have plans of like how to live in particular. Like there's plans for these kinds of situations. There's a big buffer. Basically, I don't know. I've thought about this a lot. I don't know how much details you want on my.
Well, thank
anyway,
you.
I'm not worried about it.
All right, do we want to just start? We're going to probably jump around the questions. We'll use the votes to kind of inform where we go, but not necessarily strictly there. But let's go ahead and answer that since I did promise. What are some common reasons you hear from the community on why corporations are not choosing Elm? What are the remaining blockers that we could help with? I assume that we means the Elm community at large could help with to get Elm in production more broadly.
So I can speak to this because this is kind of what guides a lot of my work. So one example of this is there were some folks at Twitch who were interested in using Elm. And from a development perspective, they were like, this is great, but they needed basically the assets to load more quickly for people who are on mobile or who are using HTML viewer for various things. So my feeling is that there's not, like, for a certain size business, there are things you need, and not all those things are done yet, and not, like, some of these things just aren't parallelizable. So that's why I've been really focusing on this particular one. But there's always this sort of, there'll be a next thing that people need, I'm sure. But I think sort of expanding those core features is a part of it. I'm not sure if anyone else has other things to add on this kind of stuff.
I guess the thing worth noting is just that, so 3 years ago, I walked into my first Elm meetup in San Francisco, and there were about 15 people there. And that was, I'm quite sure at that moment, the largest gathering of Elm developers that had ever happened. And I know that there are like over 350 people signed up for this conference. So like Elm has grown quite a lot, but this is actually a question that basically gets asked constantly. So like however big Elm has grown, a question from people is, why is Elm not bigger? And like, what is blocking Elm from getting bigger?
Yeah, so when I first read this one response, I was like, the premise isn't true. Like corporations are choosing Elm. I don't know, but it's, I'm reading the question wrong if I do that, but.
Sure,
Yeah.
but like a question that we used to get asked was like, hey, who's using Elm in production? And the answer used to be Circuit Hub. Like that was it. It was
Yeah.
basically just them.
Yeah.
And then like we were not the first. Neither was Prezi,
Right.
even though they were employing Evan at the time.
Yeah.
And so like back then the question was like why is it just like only one company? And now it's like I asked earlier how many people here are using Elm, and like half the room raised their hand. Like, I think it was actually most of the room raised their hand, which I don't think was true last year. I guess I should have asked the same question. But I mean, the number of people who are choosing Elm for work is like dramatically changing from what it was 3 years ago. And I think this question will just always be asked. Like it's like no matter how big Elm gets, like let's say it's another 3 years from now and Elm is being like it's just like a common choice, it's a normal choice, it's as normal as choosing Redux. Like and yet people will still say like, why isn't Elm the biggest? Like how come JavaScript is still bigger than Elm if Elm's so great? Like what are the blockers to Elm being the biggest in the world? But to me, my I don't know. Other people can. I realize I like talk a lot, so I don't want I don't want to steal the mic from everybody. But my perspective is just like I'll be happy if like people can use Elm at work if they want to. Like I was asking like how many people here are using Elm at work, and it was like half of the room was using it, and the other half was like I want to be using it. To me, it's like yeah, I would want it to be closer to 100% of people who want to be using Elm at work are able to.
I was just going to bring up Ruby on Rails as an analogy, because that was developed in-house, right, for Basecamp. So maybe there were like 10 developers using it. It took a while to take root. People figure it had to learn about Ruby, which they didn't know about, had to learn about Ruby on Rails and constraints and convention and stuff like that. But I think it was a grassroots acceptance that within whatever 3 or 4 years, all of a sudden, you had thousands and thousands and thousands of developers. So I'm hoping Elm would have the same trajectory because it's solving a problem that people have.
And one of the factors that's working in our favor is whenever ideas that exist in Elm show up in JavaScript, that's just a boost to the Elm community. So one way to think of it is like the difficulty of teaching immutability to some number of millions of developers. Like that's an expensive, time-consuming thing to do. And if Facebook is going to help fund that, that's great. So sort of the motion of the industry is in a direction that's quite favorable to us. So in terms of what you can do to help, one of the things that I really can't do and like I just don't have the ability is as your company starts using Elm, there's information that you have access to in that transition period that a company that's been using Elm for a long time doesn't have. So one of the things that I like to do when I talk about Elm is translate something like types to the most direct benefit that you get that sort of emotionally resonates. And for a developer, maybe that's no runtime exceptions or the error messages like help you out as opposed to. But when you're talking about bigger companies, you have more stakeholders who you have to convince, and they don't care about your life. Like, oh, you're having a bad time. It's like, well, I hope you hit your deadline nonetheless. Like, so in my view, you want to be making a different kind of argument that's like, if we do this, we're going to have this percentage fewer bug reports, and how much time do we spend on bug reports? Let's do an estimate. Okay, so now it looks like we're spending $20K a year to make this technology choice. It's like, do you want to have $20,000 or do you not want to have? Like, so you can start to make these kinds of comparisons, but getting that data is actually quite hard, and you need to do it while you're doing this transition, so you have sort of a fair comparison. So I think trying to gather that kind of information and talking about that is probably the biggest thing you can do. And the more rigorous you can, and like I really can't do that because it's like, yeah, I don't get any runtime errors, and it's like, how much money is that saving me? It's like, well, compared to before when I also, it's. So yeah, so I think that could be a really helpful thing. And another thing that I also want to emphasize is, I think the value of helping out other people in the community is really underappreciated. I mean, I think we get that it's important, but like people don't think of it as a way to contribute, and it definitely is. And so that means maybe helping someone out. at your local meetup, starting a local meetup, doing these kinds of things can be a really helpful way to do that kind of thing. And so that can create these local markets of people who can work on this team. And suddenly the question of like, who can I hire? It's like, well, look at these 30 people who show up here every month. It's like them.
There's actually
yeah.
we can go on this question for a long
Yeah,
time,
sorry.
but there's actually a related question to this that you were starting to sort of talk about. What's the best way for beginners to get involved in helping out with existing Elm open source projects, even if it's non-proofreading tasks, or sorry, non-programming tasks like proofreading documentation? The answer for me, by the way, was run a conference. The answer for a lot of people can be run a user group, but the panel should answer.
Does anyone have like personal experience with this question? I can theorize.
I do, but all right, I'm just going to talk a lot. I'll make my peace with that. Yeah, I mean, I think if you're a beginner and you're looking to help out with an existing Elm open source project, I think the best thing to do is to talk to people. So I've heard about this in other communities where people are like, I heard someone say the phrase PR or GTFO once, and I was like, that is the opposite of like how we want to operate. Like talking first. That's always like the first step. So like open a dialogue with people, because very often like one of the best ways to contribute is just to like reveal something to the author of that open source project. Like to Evan's point, like we need data on stuff. Like how was your experience? You know, say like I got tripped up by this thing. Like opening an issue about like, hey, when I first got into this was a problem I ran into. Or even just like commenting on an issue and saying like, hey, I have an idea for how we could fix this bug. Is it cool if I work on that? And the point of doing that, of like starting out with a dialogue first, is just that there's also information in the other person's head that you don't have. Like maybe that person's already working on a fix, or maybe that person's like, I figured out that the shape of the fix looks like this, but I'm missing some key ingredient to figure out how to get it the rest of the way there. And very often, I'm maybe reading a little bit too much into this question, but very often it's easy to start by a pull request, and especially as a beginner, there's usually something that you're missing, and then the author of the library is in an awkward position because they're like, okay, so I want to fix this problem, but the exact PR that you made, I can't accept because it would cause other problems, or it would make the code worse. And now they either have to say, I'm going to spend a lot of time reviewing your PR, in which case you kind of just made a lot of work for me, or I have to reject your PR and make you feel sad. So it's much better to just start with a dialogue. And in fact, I think actually, I guess like Luke could talk to this. This is kind of how Luke got into Elm CSS. He was like, hey, like I started using this. I want to add some stuff. How do I do that? And then we talked about it, and one thing led to another. Now he's a speaker.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Well, no, I think I like messaged you in Slack, and I was like, can I add this command line argument? And you were like, yeah. So it was as simple as that. Like it's not a big thing where you need to like have serious conversations with people. It's just sort of like, can I do this for you? Okay.
Just because I want to back up what these guys are saying. We're lucky to have such a beginner-centric focus in the Elm community. And I think that's big thanks to Evan's ideas on that topic, which is unique in a way. And it's actually, that makes it so that as a beginner, you have a great power to be helpful in a way that non-beginners don't. And that's kind of a unique position. And that power is to start building things yourself. So maybe instead of, what you were saying is kind of, instead of going and wanting to hack on an existing open source project, maybe the best thing you can do is make something of your own for yourself and discover what you don't understand. And and the thing here is that package authors and the language authors very much want to make this something that is accessible to beginners. So your input on why it was difficult or why it wasn't difficult is very valuable. So at the point where you're building something yourself and using someone else's library, maybe you can inform their API decisions by opening up an issue or just chatting on Slack. And I think we've had this experience recently too. Well, we've started using style elements wherever Matt is, and that's in rapid development right now in Flux, and we've been able to gain thought share from him as to how he's intended those APIs to be designed, and also give feedback and have that change kind of as we've used it. And I think that's been great for us, and we didn't do a pull request there, but certainly I think that that has helped that developed and helped us to use it as well.
We had a separate question, actually. I'm going to keep us moving along a little bit here. These questions are great, everybody. Thank you so much. Related to accessibility. So somebody get Tessa a mic. There are two questions here about this, and one of them is, will this ever get merged into Elm HTML? And the other is, have you talked about merging it into style elements? Like, what are the plans there, big picture?
Sure. So first off, thank you for the nice comment. As far as ever merged into Elm HTML, I think at this point I would be pretty hesitant to ask for that for a couple of reasons. A big one would be a big API change. Like as I showed with like the images, that's a totally different paradigm, and it would detract from some of the elegance of the HTML library as it exists. So that's a factor for sure. I think Evan is probably in a better position to talk about like long-term goals of that.
So we talked about the design of this package, and this is something that we brought up. I forget who asked, but like, I think it was just like, oh, this is neat. Like, isn't this better? Like, why allow crappy, inaccessible stuff? Like, that doesn't seem good. But yeah, the balancing pieces, when the HTML library got added, the idea was to give people in a consistent API that's like, you don't have to really remember anything except the names of the tags, full access to the DOM and any crazy stuff you can do with it. And so this is something that I'm open to, but I don't think it's like a near-term kind of thing. And I think that'll be one way we can sort of push in this direction and see how far we want to go is one of the ideas is just like making it so you can change your import from HTML to accessible HTML. And like there's a fairly straightforward upgrade path, so you can go kind of incrementally. But yeah, it's a tricky thing. And if we find ourselves in a position where like it seems less like, oh, that seems like a good idea, to just like, why have we not done this yet? I think that'll be sort of the tipping point. But
I think it probably also just makes sense for accessible HTML to exist on its own and change on its own for a while before coming back around to the idea of like either taking ideas from accessible HTML and adding them to Elm HTML or actually merging bits in.
All right, great. Next question. How much focus do you think should be put towards increasing the support for web APIs that aren't currently supported in Elm? Also, should this coverage come from the community or from core developers like Evan?
So I made this document a while ago on the Elm Lang projects repo, and it's called roadmap.markdown. And it kind of addresses this question. So my emphasis right now is getting this next release of Elm out that's going to address these asset management things. But after that, I think this is probably the next most important thing to focus on. So sort of take some time off focusing on the compiler all the time and emphasize these kinds of things. And one of the moves in 19 is when we were figuring out how to support the whole web platform, one of the questions was, how do we expand that in a nice way? So one way is just have Wild West of people can just write JavaScript, it's fine. the problem is that it's not fine. That comes with a lot of serious problems for the ecosystem, and it ties us to, imagine some future where there's another question about, like, if Elm runs on assembly, like, forget about browsers, like, it just runs on some other place. But we now need to include a JavaScript VM for some fraction, like, it just seems like a terrible disaster. And from the perspective of, like, yeah, so what we experimented with first was having a system where we could have sort of community contributions for these web APIs, and it didn't work very well. So we would try to get people to review it, and the issue was the level of coordination that it takes to get really high quality results was it was just really costly to do. And so with 19, the move is to sort of make, so part of why there's confusion about this, I think, is we weren't clear on how we wanted this process to go. And so with 19, the decision is to label the kind of backing code as kernel code. So when there's an HTTP module, it's backed by kernel code in the same way that there's kernel code in an operating system. And like, it's really, we want that code to work on a couple different platforms in very specific ways, and it's really important to get it right. And arbitrary expansion of the kernel is not ideal. So I think the current recommendation is use ports, and that may not work for everyone's situation. If you're doing things like in Murphy's talk, I think you can go really, really far. And if that doesn't work, it may make sense to circle back to Elm later, because I really don't think for the long-term health of Elm it makes sense to make this a distributed idea. Like an analogy would be, the web browsers are really limiting to me. I want support for sharing of memory across threads so I can do these cool concurrency tricks. But now I've introduced race conditions to JavaScript. And so like, should I be allowed to add that to browsers? It's like, probably not. Right, but like, would it be cool if I could do it? Totally. So there's this tension when you're designing a platform that sort of, you have to be quite careful.
I also think it's worth noting that the escape hatches that we have right now are like quite powerful. Like the fact that you can use ports or web components for that matter. Like between the two of those, it's like pretty hard to find something that you can't do. And like honestly, if my code base is 99% Elm and 1% JavaScript interop, like that's a solid code base. If something crashes, I know exactly where to look. And like, yeah, I agree with that. Certainly like that long-term philosophy, because I think that's what's made Elm today as nice as it is like that focus on like, keeping this really small kernel. One more story about 3 years ago was like, I remember shortly after that meetup, I was like talking to a coworker, and he was like, oh, so like, what's the next big thing in Elm? Like, it's going to be really cool. There's going to be these things called tasks, and you'll be able to run an HTTP request and then like chain it together with another one. Which like back then, I don't know how many people remember how it was before, but like that was like a crazy new feature once, was like talking to servers like a normal way. But like, yeah, I mean, and like also probably again 3 years from now, if we look back on today, we'll be like, hey, remember these things we had to use ports for, LOL. And we'll be like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like, but then like the thing came out and we switched to it, and then it was better. And like, it's fine, right? I mean, like predominantly the things that make Elm nice are just like the things that we use for lots and lots of business logic and lots of like the core of our applications. And except in a few use cases where it is like a big problem, certainly. Like by and large, I think like the current prioritization makes a lot of sense.
We have time for one more question, so let's talk about some more things that make Elm nice. Aside from no runtime exceptions or easy refactoring, or how can we pitch companies on Elm? Are there other reasons we should choose Elm over other JavaScript frameworks with more established ecosystems? And let's spread this one around a little bit. I'm sure everybody has their own idea about why. Except I was wrong.
So there is one additional thing that comes with like JavaScript ecosystem is you have so many things to choose from, and these pieces may not fit together well. While in Elm, kind of everything works together, everything is meant to be worked together. And I think this may be one of the reasons. Also, like setting up project boilerplate with JavaScript, you have to like put together a lot of things, and it won't bring you closer to Elm. Even if you use immutable.js, TypeScript, Webpack, and all these things. It takes a lot of time, while in Elm, you would immediately see the result already. Like, yeah.
So I used to work for a company where we built a large application in JavaScript, and everything just went very poorly because everybody was sort of doing their own thing. And it ended up being like there was like 6 developers who were all very unhappy, and they all ended up quitting. So like, me included. And like, it's just very important to have happy developers in order to sort of get encouraged to those fix problems. And one of them is actually to keep the maintenance easy and to keep the code base at a level where it's like everything is not terrible and you can see the end of a problem. So yeah, I don't know, like the emotional effect of using Elm is just really incredible.
I want to challenge a little bit the words that say more established ecosystems, just because I did this myself. I mean, within the last year, ended up kind of choosing a direction to go with what to use at work. And I had used React in the past. I think that that's what many of us think of when we think about more established ecosystems, because there's a lot of power and money and attention behind React right now, and Angular especially. And I want us to step back for a minute in our minds and really kind of think about the work that's being done and if there's a cohesive story in those areas. And what I found with my investigation was that there wasn't. Every time I have tried to use often, almost every time I've tried to use React with Redux and like maybe Redux Dux and like one of these 10 libraries for managing side effects with Redux, and then like if I'm going to do immutable data because that's a good thing that people are talking about, and I think about it, then like, well, maybe I'll use immutable.js, but maybe not. Maybe I'll use Monet, but does that work with TypeScript? And like there are like 5,000 options that kind of work with each other sometimes, and if they don't, you have to write your own custom binding code, and like I think a lot of companies are doing that. So I feel like maybe the JavaScript ecosystem as a whole is a popular ecosystem, but I'm not sure I would call it established or comfortable in my own perception. So, so just because something is popular doesn't necessarily mean it's well thought out or that it's cohesive or that it's safe. I think a lot of people also, companies especially, think that large numbers of users means that a certain choice is safe, and that may not be the case. So I encourage, when you're examining those things, to think about whether the alternative actually is that safe, or is it just the thing that people are talking about.
So something I noticed as a No-Red Inc. employee now is that I disagree with coworkers about really trivial code stuff a lot less than when I worked for companies that built UIs and JavaScripts. And I think that's because there's like consistent ways to do most things. If you have a lot of options, there seems to be a lot of like arbitrary tribalism over like how to identify if something is in an array and what operators to use to do that. And that just doesn't happen in Elm because because there's like one way to do stuff, usually. And so I finish work without feeling really frustrated for really dumb reasons most days, and it's great.
I have something to add that I don't want to end on. But
I can talk more, don't worry.
Okay. Well, I want to reemphasize, like, remember who you're talking to in a company, and also like the size of the company affects how well this is going to go over. So you can look around the whole Elm ecosystem and see like what's the maximum size company I can find, and if you're trying to introduce it to a company that's like bigger than that, you realize like you're doing a thing that hasn't been done before, and the strategies to do that may not be the same. So a lot of the things we've talked about are emphasizing the developer perspective on things, but like you have to, there's some person with all the money, like the money hose or whatever, and you just have to be like, what if it was bigger? Like I'm interested in that angle on things, and I feel like there are arguments that developers don't naturally make that might be persuasive to people who you have to be interacting with. This is without knowing if this will work out, but I think this is a direction that we should think about.
I also think that the answer to this question changes over time. So like when we were starting out, I think the answer was different than it is today. So first of all, part of the answer is, at least like if you're hiring, you can hire some pretty great people. So like there's, in business people speak, there's a market mismatch where there are a lot more JavaScript openings than there are JavaScript developers. So that's like, if you're trying to hire a JavaScript developer, like good luck. Yeah, there's like, if I'm like, I want to find a JavaScript job, it's like, oh, cool. There's a bajillion job listings that all say React and Redux. Like, why am I going to pick yours? On the other hand, in the Elm community, it's the opposite, right? Like there are, as we saw earlier today, maybe as much as like 50%, maybe more, of like Elm developers are like, I want to be using this at work, but there just aren't enough job openings yet. So if you're somebody who's trying to hire, like we are, I mean, basically if you make it known successfully, if you just like get the word out that you're hiring, like you will have way more people coming to your jobs because of Elm than because of, at least as far as we've seen, like every other reason put together. I mean, seriously, like for a while I was reading the resumes that would come in, and like that was the #1 like source of like people applying by a huge number. Like it was just like blew everything away. It was like people being like, why do you want to work in networking? Oh, because of Elm, right? I want to go do the Elm because Elm is awesome. And like if you're a company that's hiring people, like that's an advantage, right? How many people are like, I want to come here because I want to use JavaScript. I'm really psyched about going to your company to use JavaScript, right? It doesn't happen. So this is an advantage that exists because Elm is not like the most popular thing. Like it is simultaneously something that, you know, should scare people like that, but also something that should, if they're being honest, also appeal to them at the same time. Like that there's an innate advantage that comes with that from a hiring perspective. Second thing I'd say is that honestly, you don't have to make a huge deal about this anymore. There's just like a ton of success stories now. So if somebody's like, hey, what technology are you going to use this? Like, I was thinking about using Elm. Like, oh, why that? You're like, well, I keep hearing people having great experiences with it, and like not a lot of people saying that I went with Elm and regretted it. So it seems like actually it's like a much higher hit rate than there is for like React or Angular. So yeah, I'm just going to go with that. And like, that's kind of hard to argue with. It's like, oh, people love it and have a great experience and are very successful. Man, sounds like a good horse to bet on. All right, like, right? And like you can, how you frame that conversation, like kind of changes like how much pushback you're going to get. Like if you come and you say, okay, bear with me because this is a crazy idea, but I was thinking we could use this typed functional programming language that's based on lambda calculus, and like wait, and it compiles to JavaScript. It's a totally separate thing. It's got its own ecosystem. Doesn't use npm. Wait, but I swear we'll be able to hire people for it. Versus being like, yeah, like I read like 3 blog posts and saw like 2 talks about people who used Elm and they all thought it was amazing and like way better than other stuff that's out there. So I think we're like getting in on something like relatively early on. This is going to be great. Like which one sounds more more like something you want to go for? So yeah, I think that's something that we couldn't have said 2 years ago. But again, 2 years ago, I don't think if I asked how many people are using Elm at work, we would have gotten nearly as many hands go up.
Great. Student will be able to pitch Elm.
One more thing you can do if you choose Elm is submit proposals to Elm Conf about what you did with Elm, and then come speak at Elm Conf.
Yeah. And actually, while I still have this microphone, can we get a round of applause to the organizers? Because
All right, I guess that's it then, before I start crying. Ugh. All right, thank you so much, everybody, for coming this year. We'll see you all next year and at Elm Europe. Bye.